So we've seen the aggression that led to World War II. Now it's time to take a look at the total war that really encompassed World War II. Now we begin with the techniques. And remember that in the Spanish Civil War, the technique of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was tested by the Germans. All tanks and airplanes were equipped with radios, so the Germans would rapidly deploy their tanks and then use the massive air power of the Luftwaffe. Now, as opposed to a full-on assault, the Germans would communicate as to where the weaknesses were within the enemy lines and exploit them. And you can see the list of countries on the screen. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands. They smashed through all of these countries using blitzkrieg. And it really didn't take them very long to occupy Paris. An elderly Parisian would have survived 3 German invasions in their lifetime. The Franco-Prussian War, World War I, and now World War II. Japan set about attempting to control a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which included the occupation of Hong Kong, the Philippines, attacking the Dutch East Indies, and securing Singapore from the British. Now, they could have continued their push had they destroyed the American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, which, fortunately for the Allied efforts, were at sea at the time. They continued the brutality that they demonstrated at Nanjing. Hundreds of Americans and thousands of Japanese died during a forced, or should say Filipinos, died during a forced march of prisoners of war across the Bataan Peninsula in the Japanese-occupied Philippines. So you have to combine Philippine and American forces. Thousands died on this so-called death march. And the increased use of bombing was one of the most innovative and destructive techniques of World War II. In his failed attempt to invade Britain, the German Luftwaffe under Hitler bombarded London to destroy morale and institute terror. Citizens were forced to hide in the underground shelters as a refuge. On the Allied side, the Americans smashed Hamburg in the summer of 1943 in a firestorm that killed tens of thousands of civilians, while 100,000 died during the British and American firebombing of the city of Dresden. Civilians who had fled underground to avoid the bombardment suffocated because the firestorm above sucked all of the oxygen out of the air. The most famous examples of these bombings would be the first and only use of atomic weapons in warfare, when the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands and ultimately leading to the surrender of the Japanese. Meanwhile, we take a look at the Allied efforts to invade Italy via North Africa. They led the Italian populace to turn on Mussolini. He was executed and hung by his heels in humiliation. Hitler committed suicide rather than be taken alive by the advancing Soviets, who were exacting revenge for Leningrad and Stalingrad by instituting their own reign of terror on German civilians en route to Berlin. So these are the techniques that were used. And now we look at total war as it played out in World War II. And more than any other nation, the Soviets paid a steep price for World War II. The people had already been uprooted for the purpose of collectivization, and now they were moved to interior regions. Women had to care for the elderly and children, while also taking on dangerous jobs in factories and mines, while some also served with distinction in the Red Army. Stalin already had a deep distrust of the West because they failed to see the threat that Hitler posed. And he believed the Western forces waited too long to invade Western Europe and open up a new front to alleviate the pressure they were facing from the Nazis. So D-Day really helped ease the pressure on the Soviets, but Stalin simply believed that they had waited too long. By war's end, tens of millions were dead or uprooted. And it took a generation to replenish the population because the Soviets lost so many men. It also left the Soviets with an intense determination that an invasion from the West never occur again. So this strengthens their resolve to create a buffer zone in Europe as an added layer of protection. The Germans experienced total war in a bit of a different way. Nazi propaganda idealized German wives and mothers primarily as breeders of a master race, so they didn't have to work to the extent that Soviet and American women did. Near the end of the war, when the industrial centers were being bombarded, the civilians really began to feel the pressures. Boys and the elderly were conscripted into the army as German forces retreated to Berlin. The situation was somewhat similar in Japan, where the Japanese still felt the air of invincibility, given the fact that their home islands had never successfully been invaded. Like most places, freedom of speech and assembly were restricted, and the state commanded all aspects of civilian life. The civilian populace didn't feel the effects until 1944 and 1945, when continual Allied bombardments and eventual nuclear weaponry really took their toll. Now, World War II continued the trend seen in World War I in mobilizing forces of each respective empire, and also causing those in said empires to become emboldened in their struggles for freedom and to overthrow their colonial oppressors. So when we look in Vietnam, French Indochina, communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh led the resistance against Japanese occupation with cooperation from the British and the Americans. The principal concern was the Burma Road that helped supply the nationalist armies of China. So jungle warfare in Myanmar pitted African and Australian troops against the Japanese, and they were supported by Allied bombing efforts. This really took a toll, and a variety of factors led to the starvation of 2 million Vietnamese by war's end. The Vietnamese simply saw overthrowing Japan as another step towards getting rid of colonial rule forever. So, similar to what we see in World War I, it's just on a, unfortunately, grander scale.